On November 12, 1844, a mere 7 days after James Knox Polk claimed victory in one of America's most contentious presidential elections, 31 bodies were discovered floating face down in the Susquehanna River near the Pennsylvania border. Identical markings were found on each man, a crude X carved into their left palm, and each one clutched a waterlogged ballot bearing the name of the same candidate. Local authorities buried the story even deeper than the victims themselves, attributing the deaths to a riverboat accident that never actually occurred. For 180 years, the truth about what truly happened in the remote township of Millfield has remained locked away in courthouse records that were supposedly destroyed in a conveniently timed fire 3 decades later. But a conspiracy so disturbing it challenges the very foundation of American democracy has been revealed through recently discovered correspondence between a terrified county clerk and his brother. Before we continue with the story of Millfield's blood-soaked election, I need you to do something for me. If America's darkest historical secrets fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. Because the events that unfolded in Pennsylvania could have happened anywhere. In the autumn of 1844, America was caught in the grip of a political fever unlike anything the young nation had ever witnessed. The presidential race between Democrat James Knox Polk and Whig Henry Clay had not only torn families apart and set neighbors against one another but had also transformed quiet communities into ideological battlegrounds. Nowhere was this divide more pronounced than in the coal-rich valleys of central Pennsylvania, where immigrant laborists clashed with established farmers over questions of territorial expansion, tariff policies, and the growing specter of slavery's westward spread. Exemplifying this national tension in miniature was Millfield Township, nestled in the shadow of the Allegheny Mountains along the eastern bank of the Susquehanna. Roughly 400 souls called the community home, a community that straddled 2 distinct worlds. Prosperous German and Irish farming families, who had worked the fertile bottomland for 3 generations, lived in the eastern half. Their modest prosperity was built on wheat, corn, and carefully tended livestock. Led by prominent landowners like Heinrich Zimmerman and Cornelius O'Brien, these families favored Clay's American system, protective tariffs to shield their crops and federal investment in canals and roads to carry their goods to market. A different story was told entirely by the western portion of Millfield. Here, newcomers from the coal regions of Wales and Scotland had established a rough-hewn settlement around the Blackstone mine, a dangerous but profitable anthracite operation that had opened just 2 years earlier. These miners, under the informal leadership of a fierce Welsh immigrant named Gwilym Perry, supported Polk's promises of territorial expansion and lower tariffs, which would reduce the cost of the tools their industry desperately needed. Caught uncomfortably in the middle was the town's small merchant class. Store owner Samuel Hartwell, postmaster William Kensington, and local physician Dr. Edmund Fairchild tried desperately to maintain neutrality, but neutrality had become a luxury Millfield could no longer afford. The town's physical geography seemed to mirror its political divisions. A narrow valley road connected the eastern farming community with the western mining settlement, passing through a small commercial district that consisted of Hartwell's general store, Kensington's post office, Dr. Fairchild's medical practice, and the Millfield Inn, a weathered 2-story building that served as the community's unofficial meeting place. The township's most imposing structure, a sturdy limestone courthouse built in 1834, stood just south of this central area. By October 1844, this courthouse had become the epicenter of Millfield's growing political crisis. Scheduled for November 5, the same day as the presidential contest, township elections now sparked bitter competition for offices that had once been filled through gentlemanly agreement. The position of township supervisor, traditionally held by Heinrich Zimmerman, was being challenged by Gwilym Perry. The tax collector's post, long occupied by William Kensington, faced opposition from Owen Pritchard, Perry's brother-in-law. Most controversially, 4 separate candidates had been drawn to the position of Justice of the Peace, which carried the power to settle property disputes, authorize arrests, and officiate marriages. As election day approached, increasingly aggressive tactics were employed by both sides. Farmers organized torchlight parades through the mining district, singing patriotic songs that sounded suspiciously like threats to Welsh-speaking residents. Each evening, miners gathered outside Hartwell's store, their conversations growing louder and more pointed as they discussed the unfair advantages enjoyed by the old families. Children stopped playing together across factional lines, and wives ceased speaking to neighbors whose husbands supported the opposing ticket. The tension reached a breaking point on November 3, just 2 days before the election, when someone, their identity was never determined, painted crude slogans across the courthouse walls during the night. Poke means poverty appeared in dripping red letters above the main entrance, while Clay's cronies go home was scrawled across the building's eastern face. When township residents gathered the following morning to assess the damage, angry words quickly escalated into pushing matches that Dr. Fairchild barely managed to defuse by threatening to summon the county sheriff from 30 miles away. That evening, as November's chill settled over the Susquehanna Valley, final campaign rallies were held by both factions. The farmers gathered in Zimmerman's large barn, where Hinrich delivered a passionate speech about preserving the community-building values. Meanwhile, the miners assembled around a bonfire near the Blackstone mine, where Guilhem Perry spoke of opportunity and justice for working men. Each group could see the other's fire burning in the distance, and as the night wore on, those distant flames seemed to flicker with ominous promise. What none of them could have imagined was that within 72 hours, 31 members of their community would be dead, and the survivors would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether some secrets are too dangerous to keep and too terrible to reveal. November 5, 1844, dawned gray and bitter cold across central Pennsylvania. A thin layer of frost covered the Susquehanna Valley, and a persistent wind from the north carried the scent of coming snow. Despite the chill, or perhaps because of it, both factions in Millfield Township rose early and prepared for what everyone understood would be more than a simple election. As required by Pennsylvania law, the courthouse opened for voting at sunrise. Judge Ezra Hawthorne, a stern man in his 70s who had overseen township elections for nearly 2 decades, arrived to find both sides already assembled in the building's shadow. On the eastern side of the courthouse square stood Hinrich Zimmerman with his farming supporters, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as they spoke in hushed German and English. On the western side gathered Guilhem Perry's miners, their coal-blackened faces grim beneath woolen caps as they conversed in rapid Welsh that sounded like stones grinding together. The voting process itself unfolded with deceptive calm. Pennsylvania's election laws required voters to cast handwritten ballots, which were then placed in a locked wooden box under the supervision of 3 election judges. In Millfield, these positions were held by Judge Hawthorne, Samuel Hartwell, and in a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who farmed a small plot near the township's southern boundary. Throughout the morning, men from both factions approached the courthouse in small groups, cast their votes, and departed without incident. The tension was palpable but controlled, like steam building pressure in a closed kettle. Women and children watched from windows and doorways, forbidden by law from voting but deeply invested in the outcome. Even the township's dogs seemed to sense the atmosphere, staying close to their owners' heels and avoiding the courthouse square entirely. At precisely noon, as Judge Hawthorne called for a brief recess so the election judges could take their midday meal, a commotion erupted from the direction of the Millfield Inn. Owen Pritchard, Guilhem Perry's brother-in-law and candidate for tax collector, came stumbling into the square, his face blooded and his coat torn. Behind him walked 3 men that nobody in the community recognized, strangers with the rough appearance of river men, wearing heavy boots and carrying walking sticks that looked suspiciously like clubs. "They tried to buy my vote," Pritchard gasped, pointing at the strangers. "They offered me $50 to withdraw from the tax collector's race. When I refused, they said I'd regret it." Hinrich Zimmerman stepped forward, his weathered face flushed with indignation. "Who are these men? They have no business in our election." The largest of the strangers, a barrel-chested man with graying whiskers, spat into the frost-covered grass. "We got business wherever honest Americans are trying to vote," he said in an accent that placed him somewhere along the Ohio River. "Name's Pike. These are my associates, Mr. Crawford and Mr. Wade. We represent certain interests that want to see this election conducted fairly." Judge Hawthorne, despite his advanced age, possessed the authority of decades spent maintaining order in frontier communities. "I don't care who you represent," he declared, his voice carrying across the square. "This is a local election for local people. You gentlemen will leave immediately, or I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Pike's laugh was like gravel being poured from a bucket. "You'll have us arrested? With what authority? Your county sheriff is 30 miles away, and from what I hear, he's got his hands full with election troubles of his own." He gestured toward his companions. "We're staying until every vote is counted." What happened next would be debated for generations, though the facts themselves were never in dispute. Guillaume, perhaps emboldened by what he saw as an attack on a supporter or simply unable to contain months of accumulated frustration, strode across the square and confronted Pike directly. "You heard the judge," Perry said, his Welsh accent thickening with anger. "Leave our community in peace." Pike studied Perry for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Welsh coal miner, aren't you? Thought so. You people are always causing trouble where you're not wanted." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "Matter of fact, we've got a list here of troublemakers who shouldn't be voting today. Your name's right at the top." The paper Pike displayed was covered with handwriting, though from a distance nobody could make out the specific names. What they could see was that the list was long, perhaps 30 or 40 entries, and that several names had already been crossed out with heavy black lines. Dr. Edmund Fairchild, observing from the courthouse steps, felt his medical training kick in as he recognized the signs of an escalating crisis. Heart rates were accelerating, muscles were tensing, and voices were rising toward the threshold where rational conversation becomes impossible. He stepped between the opposing groups, his black medical bag somehow lending authority to his words. "Gentlemen, please," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're all Americans here. We're all neighbors. Whatever differences we have can be settled through the democratic process we're here to honor." Pike's response chilled everyone who heard it. "Democracy is a fine thing, Doctor, when it's limited to the right sort of people. But when foreigners and troublemakers start thinking they can vote themselves into power," he left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear enough. The stranger's words seemed to release something that had been building in the Millfield community for months. Heinrich Zimmermann stepped forward to support Dr. Fairchild's call for peace, but several of his farming supporters moved in the opposite direction, surrounding Pike and his associates with obvious approval. Meanwhile, Guillaume-Perry's miners began closing ranks behind their leader, their faces hardening into the expressions they wore when dangerous work needed to be done underground. Judge Hawthorne, recognizing that his authority was rapidly diminishing, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than closing the election and sending everyone home, he chose to continue with the voting process, hoping the formal structure of democratic procedure would restore order to the increasingly volatile situation. "The election will proceed as scheduled," he announced. "All qualified voters will cast their ballots in an orderly fashion. Anyone who disrupts this process will be held accountable under Pennsylvania law." But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Pennsylvania law held little sway in Millfield Township that day. Pike and his associates stationed themselves near the courthouse entrance, examining each voter with obvious scrutiny. When miners approached to cast their ballots, the strangers would consult their mysterious list and engage in whispered conferences that often resulted in challenges to the voters' eligibility. By 4 p.m., with darkness already beginning to gather in the valley, only half the expected votes had been cast. Those miners who had managed to vote did so under the hostile stares of Pike's men, while farmers who supported Zimmerman's ticket were waved through with encouraging nods. The imbalance was obvious to everyone present, but Judge Hawthorne seemed paralyzed by the complexity of the situation he faced. As the final hour of voting approached, Guillaume-Perry made a decision that would seal his fate and the fate of 30 others. He gathered his supporters, not just the miners, but also several Welsh and Scottish families who farmed small plots in the township's western areas, and marched them toward the courthouse in a compact group. Their intention was clear: they would vote as a bloc, overwhelming Pike's ability to challenge individual voters through sheer numbers. The strategy might have worked in a normal election, but November 5, 1844, was not a normal election, and Pike was not a normal observer. As Perry's group approached the courthouse steps, the stranger raised his hand in a signal that his associates clearly understood. What followed happened so quickly that witnesses would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Pike called out that he was placing the entire group under citizens' arrest for conspiracy to commit election fraud. Several miners responded by pushing forward, demanding to know by what authority Pike claimed such power. Heinrich Zimmermann's farmers, believing their opponents were attempting to rush the voting booth through intimidation, moved to block the courthouse entrance. In the growing confusion, nobody ever determined who threw the first punch. Within seconds, the courthouse square erupted into chaos. Men who had been neighbors for years found themselves locked in vicious combat. The sound of fists meeting flesh mingled with curses in English, German, and Welsh, while women screamed for their husbands to stop fighting and children scattered to hiding places behind buildings and trees. Judge Hawthorne, despite his age, waded into the melee in an attempt to restore order. He managed to reach the courthouse steps and began shouting for everyone to stop, but his voice was lost in the din of battle. Dr. Fairchild abandoned his medical bag and joined the judge's efforts, grabbing combatants and physically separating them while pleading for sanity to prevail. The fight might have burned itself out through exhaustion, as such confrontations often do, but Pike had not come to Millfield alone, and he had not come unprepared. At the height of the battle, when nearly every adult male in the community was engaged in combat, a shrill whistle pierced the air from the direction of the Susquehanna River. The sound seemed to freeze everyone in place, bruised faces turning toward the water with expressions of growing alarm. Through the gathering dusk, they could see figures moving along the riverbank, not just a few men, but dozens of them, carrying lanterns that bobbed like fireflies as they approached the township. Pike wiped blood from his split lip and smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Told you boys we represented certain interests," he said to the stunned crowd. "Those interests don't take kindly to election fraud." As the lanterns drew closer, the residents of Millfield Township began to realize they faced something far more serious than a simple election dispute. The approaching figures moved with military precision, and the light from their lanterns gleamed off objects that were definitely not walking sticks. Judge Hawthorne, his formal authority already undermined, tried one last time to assert legal control over the situation. "Whatever your grievances," he called out to Pike, "they must be settled through proper legal channels. I'm ordering you and your associates to leave this community immediately." Pike's response would be remembered by every survivor for the rest of their lives. "Judge," he said with mock respect, "your court's been adjourned." The men who emerged from the darkness along the Susquehanna's banks that evening were unlike anything the residents of Millfield had ever encountered. They moved with the disciplined coordination of military veterans, but their equipment and demeanor suggested something far more sinister than official law enforcement. Each carried a rifle and a coil of rope, and their faces bore the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence as a tool of business. Their leader, who introduced himself only as Captain Thorne, conferred briefly with Pike before addressing the assembled crowd. His voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded men in battle, though his uniform belonged to no recognized military organization. "Citizens of Millfield," Thorne announced, his words cutting through the cold November air like sharpened steel, "we have evidence of extensive election fraud, conspiracy against lawful government, and seditious activities designed to undermine American democracy. Under the authority vested in me by concerned patriots, I hereby declare this township under provisional supervision until proper order can be restored." The residents of Millfield exchanged glances of growing panic. Heinrich Zimmermann, despite the blood trickling from his nose, stepped forward to challenge this extraordinary claim. "By what legal authority do you make such a declaration? We are citizens of Pennsylvania, operating under the laws of this Commonwealth and the United States Constitution." Captain Thorne's smile was colder than the November wind. "The Constitution protects American citizens, Mr. Zimmermann. It does not protect those who would subvert American institutions through fraud and violence." He gestured towards several of his men who began unrolling what appeared to be an official document. "We have sworn affidavits from reliable sources indicating that foreign agitators have infiltrated this community for the purpose of manipulating election results." The document Thorne's men displayed was impressive in its official appearance, complete with elaborate seals and signatures. From a distance, it certainly looked like a legal warrant, though Judge Hawthorne noted several irregularities that suggested forgery. However, with armed men surrounding the courthouse square, Challenging the document's authenticity seemed both futile and dangerous. Dr. Edmund Fairchild, whose medical training had taught him to remain calm in crisis situations, attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Captain Thorne, surely any concerns about election irregularities can be addressed through proper legal channels. Our county seat has qualified officials who can investigate any allegations and ensure that justice is served. Thorne's response revealed the true nature of the threat facing Millfield Township. Doctor, the corruption we're addressing extends far beyond this little valley. County officials, state officials, even federal authorities have been compromised by the same foreign influences that have taken root here. We represent citizens who refuse to stand by while their country is stolen from them. The implications of this statement sent a chill through everyone present. What they faced was not merely a group of election observers or even ordinary criminals, but rather organized vigilantes who believed themselves to be operating above and beyond existing legal authority. Guillaume Perry, despite the obvious danger, refused to be intimidated. His years of dangerous work in coal mines had taught him that sometimes the only way to survive was to face hazards directly. "You speak of foreign influences," he said, his Welsh accent more pronounced under stress, "but I see nothing here but American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. If you have specific accusations, present them to proper authorities. Otherwise, take your men and leave our community in peace." The confrontation that followed would be seared into the memory of every witness. Captain Thorne studied Perry with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey, then nodded to Pike, who consulted his mysterious list once again. Guillaume Perry, Pike read aloud. Native of Wales, arrived in United States 1841, employed at Blackstone Mine, suspected of organizing foreign workers against American interests, advocating for policies that would benefit hostile foreign powers. He looked up from the document. "That sound accurate to you, Perry?" The Welsh miner's face flushed with indignation. "Every word of that is either false or twisted beyond recognition. I came to this country legally. I work honestly for my wages, and I vote according to my conscience as is my right as a naturalized citizen." Captain Thorne's response chilled everyone who heard it. "Rights are earned through loyalty, Perry. They can also be revoked." What happened next unfolded with terrifying efficiency. At Thorne's signal, his men began separating the crowd according to some predetermined criteria. Farmers who had supported Zimmerman's ticket were directed to move toward the eastern side of the courthouse square, while miners and their supporters were ordered to gather near the western edge. Anyone who protested or questioned this process was met with rifle butts and stern warnings about resisting lawful authority. The separation revealed the true extent of Pike's list. 31 men found themselves isolated from their families and neighbors, standing under the watchful eyes of Thorne's armed guards. The group included not only prominent miners like Perry and Pritchard but also several small farmers who had supported the Democratic ticket, a few merchants who had expressed sympathies for Irish and German immigrants, and even Thomas Brennan, one of the 3 election judges. Judge Hawthorne, despite his age and the obvious danger he faced, attempted to assert his legal authority one final time. "Captain Thorne, I cannot permit this illegal detention of American citizens. As a duly appointed judge of this township, I order you to release these men immediately." Thorne's response demonstrated the complete breakdown of legal authority that his presence had precipitated. "Judge, your appointment came from a corrupt system that we no longer recognize. These men are being detained pending investigation of their subversive activities." He paused, studying the elderly judge with obvious contempt. "Unless you'd like to join them, I suggest you confine your activities to observing." The threat was unmistakable, and Judge Hawthorne found himself facing the most difficult decision of his long career. He could continue to assert his legal authority and almost certainly be arrested or worse, or he could step aside and allow these vigilantes to proceed with their illegal actions. As darkness fell completely over the Susquehanna Valley, Captain Thorne ordered his men to light additional torches around the courthouse square. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd. "Citizens of Millfield," Thorne announced, "we will now proceed with a proper investigation of the seditious activities that have corrupted your community. Those who cooperate with this investigation will be treated fairly. Those who obstruct justice will face appropriate consequences. The 31 detained men stood in a tight group surrounded by armed guards, their faces reflecting fear, anger, and growing desperation. Their families watched from the edges of the square, held back by more of Thorne's men whenever they attempted to approach their husbands, fathers, and sons. Samuel Hartwell, the store owner who had tried to remain neutral, found his voice despite the terror that gripped him. "Captain, these men have done nothing more than vote according to their consciences. Surely that cannot be considered sedition in America." Thorne's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew noticeably colder. "Mr. Hartwell, voting is indeed a sacred American right, but voting fraudulently, conspiring with foreign agents, and attempting to subvert legitimate government are serious crimes that demand serious consequences." The store owner pressed on, perhaps recognizing that someone needed to speak for justice before it was too late. "What evidence do you have of fraud or conspiracy? What foreign agents? These are our neighbors, men we've known for years." Captain Thorne gestured toward Pike, who produced another official-looking document. "We have extensive documentation of communications between these men and agents of hostile foreign powers. We have evidence of organized efforts to manipulate election results. We have witnesses who will testify to seditious conversations and planning." The documents Pike displayed appeared impressive, filled with official seals and elaborate handwriting. However, Judge Hawthorne, despite his precarious position, noticed that the papers were held too far away for anyone to read the actual content. He also observed that Thorne's men seemed nervous, constantly glancing toward the river, as if expecting something or someone. Dr. Fairchild attempted to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in their captors. "Captain, even if these accusations were true, surely the proper course would be to turn these men over to county authorities for trial. Summary justice serves no one and helps nothing." Thorne's response revealed the true depths of the conspiracy that had descended upon Millfield Township. "Doctor, county authorities are part of the same corrupt system that allowed this situation to develop. State authorities have been compromised by the same foreign influences. We represent the only remaining hope for justice in this matter." The implications were staggering. What the residents of Millfield faced was not merely a group of vigilantes operating outside the law, but rather an organized conspiracy that claimed to supersede all existing legal authority. As the night wore on, it became increasingly clear that Captain Thorne and his men had not come to Millfield for a simple election intervention. They had come prepared for something far more sinister, and the 31 detained men were about to discover exactly what that something was. The temperature continued to drop as midnight approached, and a thin layer of snow began to fall across the Susquehanna Valley. In the flickering torchlight, the snowflakes looked like ash from some distant fire settling over the courthouse square with ominous silence. As the clock in the Millfield courthouse tower chimed midnight, Captain Thorne made an announcement that transformed an already terrifying situation into something approaching absolute horror. The 31 detained men would be transported to a secure location for detailed interrogation regarding their alleged seditious activities. The secure location, it quickly became apparent, was not a proper jail, but rather a collection of abandoned buildings near an old ferry crossing 3 miles downstream along the Susquehanna. The site's isolation made it perfect for activities that required freedom from observation. Thorne's men bound the detainees' hands with rope and formed them into a column for the march to the river. The sight of their neighbors, husbands, and fathers being led away like prisoners of war proved too much for several family members. Mrs. Catherine Perry, Galeem's wife of 15 years, broke free from the crowd and ran toward her husband. "You cannot take him," she cried, her Welsh accent thick with emotion. "He has committed no crime. He voted as is his right under American law." One of Thorne's guards roughly pushed her back, but not before she managed to grasp her husband's bound hands. "Whatever they accuse you of," she whispered urgently, "remember that truth will prevail. God sees everything, even in darkness." Her words would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The march to the old ferry crossing took nearly 2 hours through difficult terrain. The detainees, still wearing their election day clothes, were forced to navigate muddy paths and steep riverbank slopes while bound and under constant guard. Dr. Fairchild, who had been permitted to accompany the column, observed details that his scientific training compelled him to remember. Thorne's men moved with obvious familiarity through terrain that should have been unknown to outsiders, suggesting planning that extended far beyond the November 5 election. The abandoned ferry crossing consisted of several weathered buildings surrounding a stone wharf. The largest structure, a drafty warehouse, had been prepared for their arrival. Lengths of rope hung from ceiling beams, chairs were arranged in a rough circle, and several tables held knives and hammers that gleamed ominously in the lantern light. Pike, who seemed to serve as Thorne's chief deputy, consulted his list one final time. "Gentlemen, you are here because reliable sources have identified you as participants in a conspiracy to subvert American democratic institutions through fraud, intimidation, and coordination with hostile foreign powers. The severity of these charges demands thorough investigation." Guillaume Perry, despite his bound hands and desperate circumstances, refused to be intimidated. What sources? What foreign powers? These are wild accusations without foundation. Pike's smile was colder than the November wind whistling through the broken windows. "Mr. Perry, your own words and actions provide all the evidence we need. You have publicly advocated for policies that would benefit foreign nations at America's expense. You have organized foreign workers against American interests. You have conspired to manipulate election results through illegal voting practices." The Welsh miner's face flushed with indignation. "Every word of that is false. I have advocated for fair wages and safe working conditions. I have helped fellow immigrants understand their rights under American law. I have voted according to my conscience, which is my right as a naturalized citizen." Captain Thorne stepped forward. "Rights, Mr. Perry, are earned through loyalty and maintained through obedience to lawful authority. When foreign-born residents conspire against American..." As morning light filtered through the broken windows, several patterns became clear. The torture was designed to force confessions to predetermined crimes. The interrogators seemed less interested in actual answers than in creating documentation to justify their conclusions. And most ominously, several of Thorne's men began making references to final solutions. By mid-morning, it became clear the detainees would not be returning to their families. Dr. Fairchild, using supplies from his medical bag, managed to write a brief message describing the situation and hid it in his coat, hoping it might someday reach authorities. As the afternoon wore on, Thorne's men began making preparations for something that would occur after darkness fell. Boats were moved into position along the wharf, and ropes were checked and rechecked. The 31 men spent their final hours in conversations ranging from desperate planning to quiet acceptance. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Captain Thorne. "Gentlemen," he announced, "you have been found guilty of sedition, conspiracy, and treason against the United States of America. Under the extraordinary circumstances that face our nation, and in the absence of legal institutions capable of addressing crimes of this magnitude, you will be executed according to the judgment of loyal American citizens." The warehouse fell silent. Guillaume Perry found his voice one final time. "Captain Thorne, history will judge what you do here today. You may silence our voices, but you cannot silence the truth of what we represent. The promise that America belongs to all who embrace its ideals, not merely those who share your prejudices." Thorne's response demonstrated the complete moral corruption that had enabled his actions. "Mr. Perry, history is written by survivors. After tonight, your version of American ideals will be nothing more than a cautionary tale about the price of disloyalty." As darkness fell on November 6, 1844, Captain Thorne's men began implementing a plan developed with meticulous attention to detail. Each prisoner would be weighted with stones, taken out onto the river in small boats, and thrown into the deep water near the main channel, where the current would carry the bodies downstream. Any remains that surfaced would appear to be victims of river accidents far from Millfield. Dr. Fairchild made one final appeal. "Captain, I beg you to reconsider. These men have families who love them, children who depend on them. Whatever crimes you believe they have committed, surely they do not deserve death." Thorne's response revealed the ideological fanaticism that drove him. "Doctor, sometimes society must be purged of corrupting influences before it can heal. These men represent a cancer that threatens the very survival of American civilization. Their removal is not murder. It is surgery." As the prisoners were led to the wharf, Several attempted desperate escapes that only resulted in beatings. Dr. Fairchild, forced into his final boat ride, managed to slip the message he had written into a crevice between stones on the wharf. The boat moved slowly through the dark water, guided by guards who seemed reluctant to complete their task. In the end, however, their hesitation proved irrelevant. The current that would soon carry 31 bodies downstream showed no mercy. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millfield intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The final boat returned to the wharf at approximately 3 a.m. on November 7, 1844. Captain Thorne's men had successfully murdered 31 American citizens. What they had not anticipated was that their operation would begin to unravel almost immediately. The first sign of trouble was Dr. Fairchild's horse, which had broken free and wandered back to Millfield, raising immediate alarm. Mrs. Catherine Perry organized a search party that discovered the horror at the ferry crossing at dawn. The warehouse showed signs of torture, but more disturbing was what was missing. 31 men had vanished. Heinrich Zimmermann discovered crucial evidence: footprints, rope fragments, and personal items proving specific individuals had been present. Most damning of all, they found Dr. Fairchild's message, documenting the conspiracy with a physician's precision. The survivors faced a terrible dilemma. Reporting the massacre to potentially corrupt authorities was risky. They realized their community had been infiltrated by informants who had compiled the death lists. A secret investigation revealed Captain Thorne represented a network of political extremists called the American Patriots Alliance, which had orchestrated similar violence throughout the region. The breakthrough came from Judge Hawthorne, who used his old legal contacts to convey information to federal authorities in Philadelphia. A team of federal marshals arrived with warrants, but Thorne and his men had vanished. The investigation uncovered the alliance's reach and sympathizers within government, but its cellular structure prevented the capture of its leaders. The legal proceedings established precedents but provided little comfort to the families. Millfield Township never fully recovered. The mine closed, trust evaporated, and children grew up hearing whispered stories. Mrs. Perry became the keeper of the memory. The broader impact sent shockwaves through immigrant communities, leading to new laws against political violence. In 1863, a dying Confederate soldier confessed to participating in the murders, revealing the alliance had evolved into a secessionist network, connecting the massacre to the broader ideological conflict that led to the Civil War. In 1867, a congressional commission investigated the massacre, concluding that such vigilante groups posed a greater threat to democracy than the foreign influences they claimed to oppose. The ferry crossing was reclaimed by the forest. Yet, the memory influenced the community for generations, teaching that constitutional rights require constant defense against extremism, even from those who claim to be its most devoted defenders. The 31 men were victims of a failure of American society to protect the rights it guaranteed. This mystery shows us how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when citizens lose faith in legal processes and resort to violence. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe everything was brought to light, or could there be more victims we'll never know about? Leave your comment down below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this one, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. I'll see you in the next video.